Hey, this is Kip Weston. I've had a lifelong fascination with adventure, whether that's climbing, mountaineering, or even diving into history. I'm obsessed with uncovering stories from extraordinary people, people who break from the average and become outliers. Now I want to share their stories with you. This episode, I'm speaking with Chris Weidner. Chris is a writer and climber. He has some of the most introspective articles on climbing I've ever read. Further, he's a wildly accomplished rock climber with over 3 decades of climbing experience. He's sent many of 514, but what I wanted to hear covered was how Chris climbed the highest big wall multi-pitch in North America called the Gambler's Fallacy, which is rated 513B. Chris and I discussed his writing process, his relationship with climbing, and even touched on another hobby we both share, free diving. So, let's get into it. My first question is, how long have you been writing about climbing?
Let's see. I've been writing about climbing since I think the late 1990s, maybe 1998.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it started just super small. I'd maybe write 1 or 2 articles a year for a really tiny publication up in the Northwest, but it definitely got the seed planted then. But yeah.
Yeah. And had you been a writer before that too?
Just a personal, writer. I like to write a journal. In fact, I think I kept a journal since I was like 8 years old.
Yeah.
So yeah, I spent quite a bit of time writing actually, but mostly just for myself.
Yeah.
So,
Because the
yeah.
two adjectives that come to mind when I read your articles, I would say is 1, honest, and then 2, economical. You fit a lot into like a pretty tight blog post.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I try to be honest. I think that's kind of what people can identify with most. And yeah, actually, for better or worse, for the newspaper, my articles have a pretty strict 700-word limit. So, gosh, I'd say for most of what I write, I wish I had like 5 times, 10 times more space to write. But yep, I gotta just cut it down. So it's tricky, but that's what I got to do.
In terms of like end to end from ideation to publish, what's the hardest part in that process? Is it editing a big idea into 700 words, or is it forming the original idea?
I actually really enjoy the editing part. If I have 3,000 words and it has to get down to 700, it's tough sometimes, but I like it.
Yeah.
For me, the hardest part is definitely just coming up with a topic that I think climbers and non-climbers alike are going to be able to relate to and enjoy. And then kind of the initial work on it, just going from having nothing to something. It's kind of embarrassing how much time I've spent in front of my computer with a blank page, just like not able to get something out. Sometimes I really have to wrestle with it.
Do you have a strategy for overcoming writer's block or some sort of get something going where your creative juices get flowing?
For me, like the default strategy happens to just be procrastinate until I absolutely have to get it done, and then something will come up. I prefer not to do it that way, but it's definitely come to that many times.
Where was the initial motivation to begin journaling?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think it was just being a kid and maybe wanting to have a conversation in a way that I didn't end up having with a person. I think it was just a nice way for me to express my thoughts. And for some reason, for me, writing down my thoughts and my feelings made me feel better. So I just kind of turned to that. Yeah.
Yeah, what a healthy and productive outlet to find at a young age then.
Yeah, I mean, it was good, I think, for me then. And even still is. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Were you a big reader too growing up?
Yeah, I like to read a lot. As a young kid, I read a lot of just standard fiction for young adults or young people. But pretty soon, like early teens, I got more into reading about the outdoors.
Yep.
And then pretty quickly, I read as much as I could about climbing. I'd go to the bookstore and or the library and just see whatever they had and read everything I could. So
What were some of those first books that, or authors maybe, that turned you on to the idea of outdoor recreation?
You know, early on, like Jack London, his
Yeah.
books. I started also reading some John Muir writing. And then when I got more into the climbing books, I was heavily influenced by John Krakauer, David Roberts, Greg Child, and then a bunch of British writers, probably Chris Bonington the most. Yeah, just kind of really related to what these guys were writing about.
So when do you make the transition from thinking of outdoor activity that happens on a book to doing it in your real life? If you're just reading about outdoor activity and adventure, when do you think
Uh-huh.
like, oh, I should pursue this for myself and see where it goes?
Well, when I first started reading about trips like Mount Everest, reading Bonington and things like that, or reading Krakauer's Journeys in Alaska. At first it was just this fantasy thing, but I guess where it really started being incorporated into what I actually was going to do or wanted to do is just after getting more climbing experience and starting to realize, oh, maybe I am capable of doing these things that I've read about for so long.
That's really cool. Who introduced you to climbing?
I started climbing actually at a summer camp up in Washington State called Camp Nor'Wester. It was up in the San Juan Islands, and it was just like a regular summer camp with month-long sessions, so it was pretty long. And there happened to be a 60-foot rock, a big like granite boulder in the middle of the camp property, and so they had rock climbing, they had top roping on it, and then also it was pretty close to Mount Baker, right near the Canadian border, and so one of the potential trips to do during that month-long session was Mount Baker climb, and only like 10 or 12 campers got to do that. There was a bike trip, you could do a canoe trip. So I was just immediately drawn to the Baker idea. It sounded the most challenging of the trips that you could do, and it just sounded cool.
Is your family always into the outdoors?
Not really. I was kind of an outsider when it came to that. My dad was really into, he liked adventure. He was more of an armchair adventurer, but he actually did later, after my first session at Camp Nor'Wester, when I learned to climb a bit, he actually accompanied me on a Mount Rainier climb when, before I knew a whole lot. I went guided with Rainier Mountaineering with my dad and a few friends. My dad didn't quite make it. He kind of pooped out at 12.5 or something like that. And I kept going. But that was about the extent of the outdoor stuff in terms of my family. I was, again, kind of an outlier doing my own thing.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
how much convincing did you have to do to get him on that initial trip?
Well, surprisingly, it was his idea.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
it's like, I'm not sure where it came from because my dad was never a climber, but
Yeah.
I think he just kind of liked the idea of heading up there. He didn't really do much hiking or anything. I think a friend of his, maybe, who had climbed it, a business partner of his, really encouraged my dad to do that. So it was actually me going on the trip he wanted to do. So
Do you think there's a benefit to finding a love for the outdoors and climbing on your own versus being with a family that you grow up with it? And sometimes I think about like some of my friends whose families are very outdoors. They have to go through this cycle of falling in love with the sport themselves versus just doing like another family weekend.
absolutely. Yeah, it's a interesting idea because, yeah, if you can find something like the outdoors or climbing on your own and just immediately have it as your own thing, I think that's really powerful. I think it's awesome though when families can also just provide that for a kid and just kind of hope they run with it or not. But yeah, I think both have their benefits.
So learn about climbing at camp, and you've been climbing now for over 3 decades. Is that right?
Yeah, yep, that's right.
And so how has your relationship with the sport changed over those decades?
It's changed in quite a few ways. The most significant is probably the fact that I used to use climbing as an escape. Not when I first started. It was just this fun, adventurous thing. But once I got into later in high school and college, and then kind of just after college, I had maybe a less healthy relationship with climbing at the time. I was more into like, just get me out of my current life situation. Let me just get into the mountains and do something kind of dangerous. And I kind of fantasized about being off in the mountains all the time. And I used it as a means of coping, I think. Whereas after that, in my later 20s and onward, I feel like I had a much more healthy relationship with it. It was like, hey, this is actually just something I really want to do. And I don't need the danger. I don't, that's not what I'm looking for. It was more about close relationships with my climbing partners.
Yeah, that's a really interesting evolution. I'd
Yeah,
love to
yeah.
pick into the middle of your journey then. What is it about climbing that you think lends itself so readily to obsession, where you can't just,
Mm.
no pun intended, but put your head in the clouds all day thinking about it?
Yeah. Um, well, it's probably similar to other, dangerous sports or whatever, where it does require a level of focus that I haven't really found in other areas of life. Um, it's just a guess, but I feel like maybe that requirement of mental acuity uh, really is addicting, because it feels good when you face a challenge that has consequences. You get through it, and then it's like, okay, wow, I can do that. And then, of course, it's like, ooh, what's the next thing? Um, that's for me, that's pretty unique to climbing. I'm sure other people find that in other sports, but yeah, I think with climbers, as you pointed out, it's climbers tend to be more obsessed than other people in other sports. So my guess is it has to do with that mental side.
In terms of the challenges of climbing, which are you more drawn towards or proud of overcoming? The mental challenges, you have great articles on overcoming fear, or is it more the physical accomplishments of sending something really physically hard?
I really enjoy both, but
Yeah,
I'd say the mental challenge of climbing is far more alluring to me, and I think it's actually far more of what climbing is to me, than the physical. I think, even, what am I trying to say? I think most successful climbers, no matter what type of climbing they're doing, um, have a strong mental game. At least for one or more genres of climbing. And I think it's easy to attribute success to strength, especially in things like bouldering and sport climbing. But I actually see a lot of people who may not be as strong as others. I see them being far more successful, even at the strength genres of bouldering and sport climbing.
yeah,
If if that makes sense, yeah.
definitely. You've sent many 514 in your day, and so I'm wondering, like, when you approach in that same vein of like, do I want something that challenges me mentally or physically? When you're looking at new projects, how much does the grade impact what you want to spend your time doing?
Yeah, I'd say with sport climbing, for example, the grade does matter quite a bit, I'd say.
Yeah,
It's obviously subjective, and I think any climber with any kind of experience knows that. I mean, um, a 511 here is going to be very different from a 511 there. But overall and over time, I think it tends to even out. And so I think the number grades actually do have an impact on what I choose to do, because they're really the only measure we have of difficulty in climbing. And yeah, it's nice to see progression, and the only way to measure that really is through grades. And yeah, I think it's fun to pick a number and try to find one at a new cliff and go for it, even if it's an easy one or a hard one or whatever. So yeah, like I'd say the numbers are important to me in terms of what I choose to try, but afterward, after climbing it or failing on it, the experience is what matters. But the number is important into choosing an objective.
yeah, that's interesting. On that, could you walk me through how you went about choosing to do the gambler's fallacy?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so that's a route up on the diamond of Long's Peak, and gosh, I went up there with my friend Bruce Miller. He and I did this project together, and at first we were just looking for some new free line. We had a good idea of where it might go because of a route we put up like 7 years earlier that was nearby, and so we went right to this area where we knew there were some cracks that were unclimbed, and a couple of blank looking faces too. And we just kind of swung around and looked for them. So that's kind of how we started on Gambler's Fallacy. It took a few days of kind of hunting for the for the free line to find a thing that we thought would actually go. But after trying it for a little while, we thought, oh man, this might be too hard for us. Like we weren't quite finding the precise route. I think we were trying variations that were a little more difficult than it turned out to be. But
Yeah.
Essentially, we just wanted to do a good-looking new free route, and what we ended up finding was hard enough that it kind of kept us going. If it was much easier, that would have been great. If it was a whole lot harder, it would have been maybe too hard. So we kind of found it just right, I'd say.
Can you describe from a macro view like what that climb is?
Yeah. So Gambler's Fallacy is a what is it? 9 pitches up the diamond of Longs Peak. The start of the route is at about 13,000 feet, and so you top out right near the summit of Longs Peak, over 14,000 feet, and it's the first half of it is easier rated climbing, but pretty physical, off width climbing, kind of steep, burly 511 cracks, and then the top half of the climb. We added a few bolts to some face climbing, which is up to 13B, and it follows some seams, and just tops out the diamond like right near the apex. So it's a pretty neat climb, I think.
Yeah, and I saw it took you almost 50 days of projecting to send it.
Yeah. It included in those 50 days were quite a few days where we got either stormed off before we could make any progress. It included the 4 or 5 days of kind of swinging around on ropes. But yeah, it was a huge effort over 4 different summers from 2017 through 2020. Both Bruce and I climbed the route in 2020. And yeah, it's not the hardest route on the diamond, but it's a pretty cool route, and it's maybe the 3rd hardest route up there. So
yeah, there's a great video of you climbing it out on YouTube. And I wonder, like, does knowing that it's going to be filmed for a short film affect how you climb or affect your motivation at all?
I think that day actually it was pretty incredible actually, that film, which John Glassberg and Jess Glassberg, his wife, they filmed it, and I think it turned out really well, and they only went up one day, and so it just happened to be okay. I was ready to try to send it, and they decided to come up, and it all worked out. But that particular day, I don't feel like being filmed affected me much, because I was really focused just on choosing that day because of the weather. I felt like I had rehearsed it well enough that I could do it. It certainly wasn't at all guaranteed, but I figured I had a good shot. The weather was perfect. And Bruce was totally in support mode for me that day. Later on, I supported him on his free ascent. And so everything kind of lined up. And then kind of last minute, John and Jess were going to come up and film me. So I just thought, cool, more friends on the wall. That'll be fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, that day, I think there was so much lined up already. And I was pretty zeroed in on it that I don't think it affected my climbing at all. It was just kind of fun to have John and Jess to talk to up there.
Oh, that's interesting. See, I would have thought cameras on, it's game time. Like you'd have a little extra in your tank to send, but
yeah, I don't think I had any extra. I pretty much kind of gave it all I had, and filming or not, I think just what would have happened.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing film. It's really worth a watch.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think John did great. Yeah.
And kind of on sending projects of your own, and we're in the middle of climbing being in the Olympics. I'm curious, a lot of your articles touch on the relationship between competition and climbing. My question is, tell me if it's too broad, but what do you think that relationship is? I think climbing is unique in that the overtly competitive parts are very elective.
Yeah, very much so. Um, I guess I see competition climbing, like competition climbing,
Yeah,
Olympics, that thing. Um, it's a totally separate genre from other climbing. And certainly the most different from real climbing, outdoor climbing, I should say.
yeah,
Um, but I think it's awesome. And I guess the relationship nowadays is really interesting because I think a small percentage of the high-end competition climbers are bringing their skills outdoors, and just it's shocking and awesome to see how hard they can climb. And I say a small percentage because really it seems to me that a lot of competition climbers kind of choose to stay in that genre. And so, most of them will dabble outside, but a lot of them are just so focused on competing that they don't really have the time or energy to climb outdoors anyway. So there is a big separation between competition climbing and outdoor climbing. But those who do choose to cross over and become outdoor climbers, gosh, I can't imagine a better way to start out and just be prepped to be strong and good.
yeah. Would
Yeah.
you describe yourself as competitive?
No, I wouldn't actually. I am competitive with myself for sure,
Yeah,
but I actually tend to back away from competition. I have done a few climbing competitions for fun, like local things over the years, but yeah, I don't really like direct competition with other people.
could you expand on what you mean by competitive with yourself and how that might manifest in climbing?
Yeah, yeah. I guess what that means is I am really detailed about setting goals and about um, trying to progress in a measured way. And again, that kind of goes back to ratings and how well that's our measure, so they're important to me. Yeah, I try to kind of up the ante for myself when it feels right. For example, like right now in sport climbing, my long-term goal is a route of a grade that I haven't yet climbed, and I'm working on that, and that's a way that I'm like trying to push myself to improve. I'm trying to train a little better, a little harder. Um, Other years I'll have different goals, like maybe try to climb a certain number of hard multi-pitch routes or whatever it is. Yeah, I just like keep it fun. And for me, fun is kind of comparing how am I doing now to how I was 5 years ago or last year or 20 years ago. And in each genre, as I kind of focus on one or another, I often will be, sucking in some ways and then doing well in others.
So do you have internal metrics then for how successful you would be as a climber? Like if this was a successful year for you, if you hit your goals or not, or do you have more vague goals like, oh, I just had a fun year climbing with friends, so that was a successful year for me? How do you break that down?
Yeah, so I do, like I said, I write down some goals. However, my goals are often maybe not set perfectly, so that, for example, some years I've I've only done 10% of the goals that I had written down, but I felt like it was a successful year because the one or two things I did do, for example, something like Gambler's Fallacy, felt really important to me, special to me. So if I didn't happen to climb, this thing or that thing that year, so be it. I guess it really comes down to how important each goal or how important each little milestone, even like a training milestone, is to me. And I think at this point, um, there's a lot of you could say failure in my climbing. I mean, there's a lot of times I most often don't reach the goals I have. So I do try to look at success as just little things, tiny
Yeah.
steps, and and if I kind of spread my climbing out enough and kind of take things apart, I can find success in certain areas almost anytime. So that's what I try to focus on.
Yeah. Did you ever do skateboarding?
I did have a skateboard for a couple of years, and I just fell a lot. And
Yeah.
so no, not really. I never considered myself a skateboarder.
There just
Why is
seems like
that?
a lot of parallels. Like with skateboarding, it's like you're describing with your goals, you just fall and fail and fail and fail and fail, and then you hit something like a little bit better, and that's
Yeah,
like a success for you. You're like, oh, okay, I did it for today. I got what I
yeah,
wanted to do.
yeah. I see what you're saying. Are you a skateboarder?
No, but just growing up, I think that attitude of like, okay, I'm just gonna fall until I get it.
Yeah, yeah,
Climbing is nice in that it's such an immediate feedback if you succeeded or not.
yeah, yeah. That's true. I like that a lot because yeah, I mean, even just training indoors. Maybe one day I'll do a problem I had tried 10 other times in the last couple of years, and if I do it, it's like, oh wow, okay. That
Yeah.
that may or may not have any impact on what I do outside next week, but that was a success. Yeah.
Growing up, did you do any other sports?
I was a runner for quite a while.
Yeah.
I did cross country in high school, and actually before that, even in elementary school, I ran a few half marathons, and then
And this is
yeah,
all in
cross country.
Washington?
Yeah, yep. This is in Washington near Seattle, and yeah, cross country in high school, and then in college, I kind of got back into some half marathons, and I ran a few marathons. And then the other thing I did in high school was soccer. Yeah, elementary, middle, and high school, I played soccer.
Do you still do long distance running?
I don't anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I feel like once climbing gets introduced.
so that was actually a tough thing for me because actually in high school and college, there was a moment where climbing and running were kind of competing for my energy, and I was trying to push both of them for myself during certain seasons, and inevitably I would just end up being exhausted. I just realized at some point I couldn't do both, and so I chose climbing.
How it'd be interesting to see how different your life would be had you chose running.
Yeah, yeah, that would be interesting.
I had a great time reading. You have an article called Higher Ground, and in it you talk about kind of different perspectives for the climbing community at large around how popular climbing has become recently.
Yep.
And in it, you talk about how it's generally a good thing. It's a good thing that climbing is getting more popular, and you kind of outline a few arguments for why we should be excited climbing is getting more, quote, mainstream. And I'm curious, is that an opinion you've always felt, or is that something you've kind of grown to appreciate as you've watched the sport grow over 3 decades?
I've always thought more climbers is better. In part just because I thought climbing was so cool and it changed my life in such a positive way, that I just thought, hey, if more people could experience this same feeling that I'm having or something like that, uh, the better. And there's certainly plenty of climbing to go around. That was definitely the case in the 1980s and 1990s. Now, yeah, a lot of people say climbing's too concentrated. There's too many people and too little rock. I totally disagree with that. I mean, even today, for example, I was just up in Boulder Canyon, and it was a beautiful morning, and I climbed 6 new routes that I had never done before, and we didn't see a single other climber in this whole area of Boulder Canyon. That's beautiful, and there's loads of good trad climbs and sport climbs. It's funny. There's a small percentage of zones where yes, they're going to be crowded, especially on weekends. But I feel like even on in the Front Range of Colorado here, where there's a ton of climbers, most of the places that I go to climb, it's just not at all crowded. I often am the only climber there, me and my partner, and sometimes there might be one other party. So that goes against what a lot of people experience. I realize that, but I think if you're willing to just take one step away from the most popular cliffs, there's so much out there that's still adventurous. There's first ascents to do. There's loads of good already established climbs that aren't going to be crowded. So yeah, I've always felt that way, actually, that that the more the merrier with climbing.
You had some really good points in it. And I do wonder, there is an element of, when I look at kind of early climbing history, this sort of renegade attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Is something lost? Is there an aspect of climbing becoming more popular and mainstream where we lose that renegade attitude to climbing, or do you think that will always be an element?
I think you can find what you're looking for in climbing. Certainly, competition climbing, most bouldering, sport climbing, even a lot of trad climbing and stuff. There may not be a renegade element at all, just because it's pretty normal, you know. But if you want adventure, if you want off the grid feeling or the renegade attitude, you just don't have to go far, and climbing can provide that. So I think it just depends what you're looking for and what you want to experience.
What would your advice be for someone who really loves bouldering at their local gym and is curious about trying outdoor climbing?
I think the gyms are such a great place to meet climbers, and maybe just kind of ask around and see who's going outside and tag along. I think that's a great way to start. That's kind of how I ended up climbing outside after I went to camp. I came back to Seattle and I was like, well, now what? I don't know anybody here who climbs. And actually, it turns out the University of Washington was like a 13-mile bike ride from my house. So I'd ride my bike on weekends to the University of Washington. They had an outdoor, like an outdoor climbing facility, basically, that was built in the 70s, and it's actually really still relevant. Anyway, so I'd go there on weekends. That would be what climbing was to me for a long time, until at that outdoor facility, I would just start conversations with people, and eventually people were like, okay, hey, yeah, you haven't climbed outside much, let's how about we go out next weekend? And yeah, so I just kind of met some people that way. I can only imagine nowadays it's just far, far easier to meet people who are going to be going outside, especially boulderers.
Were there reservations on your end for going from, I know it's an outdoor wall, but still maybe a more protected wall towards the true outdoors?
For sure, especially when I was just kind of going out with people I just met that day. Like, okay, yeah, so next weekend you're going to pick me up and we're going to go where? And, you know, do you have the right equipment? Like, yeah, I was definitely like a little nervous, but I was way more excited than I was nervous. So,
Did you have
yeah.
anyone that talked you through how to use the equipment? Or is that kind of self-taught for a lot of your more technical side of climbing?
Well, so I did a ton of reading about climbing, as we talked about earlier, but I also read like Freedom of the Hills cover to cover, and just tried to learn everything I possibly could about the gear beforehand. But yeah, certainly there were times where I just have to ask, like, hey, what's going on here? Like, for example, one of the first people I ever climbed with outdoors in Washington was this guy. His name was Krog. Actually, it was Willie Unsold's son, and Willie Unsold was famous for being a guide on Mount Rainier, and he actually he died in the mountains later on. But this guy Krog took me out climbing, and he climbed with double ropes, and we went to Index, a really popular trad area now, and back then it was more obscure. And he was like, so do you know how to belay with double ropes? I'm like, no, I have no idea. I've never used, two ropes before. So
Yeah,
that's just kind of, piece
he's
by
like Mace
piece, like,
Windu.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, like partner by partner, and different route. I would just kind of learn these little things along the way. So,
Do you have any stories where you feel like you got away with something, where you finished the climb and are like, "Ooh, that was a little spicy"?
oh yeah, definitely. Trying to think. Well, certainly there was the the time where my partner and I got away with something maybe the most was in the Peshastin Pinnacles, which is a little area of soft sandstone towers in eastern Washington. And my climbing mentor and sort of father figure, Dallas Clokey, who I met up in Washington. We did a lot of mountains together. We were going to climb in the Cascades, but the weather was poor as we were driving up. There was just pouring rain, so we just kept driving over the mountains into eastern Washington. we climbed this 2-pitch 5.8, and he figured, at the time I was going down to Smith Rock now and then. I had climbed some 5.12s, maybe a 13 minus, and so he just figured out it's 5.8. Chris isn't going to fall. So he led the first pitch, got into this little belay cave. I started leading the second pitch, and there was, I think, a couple of fixed pins, but mostly gear. I'd placed a cam, and then a foothold broke, and I started sliding down the slab, and the cam ripped out a flake of rock. The rock was just super fragile. So I fell past the belay and then got caught. And
So factor 2.
so it was a factor 2 fall into the anchor, probably slightly lessened by the fact that it was a slab. So it wasn't like my full weight. There's a little of friction taken off, but yeah, factor 2 fall into the anchor. Dallas actually got ripped out of his stance a little bit, and he kind of shock loaded the anchor. And then by the time I kind of dusted myself off and crawled back up into that cave, I noticed he had only placed a single nut as an anchor, a single nut. And he had a rack of cams on him. He was an older guy at the time. I think he was late 50s, but a mountain guy, not really a rock guy as much. And he didn't know how to place cams. And so we were using my rack, and he had these cams that would have made a perfectly good 3 or 4 piece anchor. And he had instead just like, well, I know how to place nuts. He put in one. And
oh my gosh.
that one nut is what kept us both from, like, I don't know, a 50-foot ground fall.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was crazy.
That's a great story. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, and what's worse is when I pulled Dallas out of the cave and he shock loaded the anchor, the nut actually slid in the crack it was in. It slid a couple of inches down. Yeah, it was kind of miraculous, actually, that it held.
What do you do after that?
God, what we did is we went to the hospital, because it turns out I was kind of bloody and scraped up and my back hurt, but Dallas broke a couple fingers when the rope he was leading to me as I fell past him. The rope actually went over his hand as he held the belay device, and it crushed a couple of his fingers. So yeah, so we went to the hospital, and then I think we kind of tucked our tails and drove home. Yeah.
Oh, that's a wild story.
Yeah, that was a wake up call for sure. I taught him how to place cams the next time we went out.
That's so interesting. Oh my gosh. Kind of in that same vein, you have another great article I enjoyed reading called "Fear is My Constant Companion."
Yeah.
And I wonder, like, with climbing, how do you think about distinguishing between appropriate fear and fear that isn't useful? Does that make sense?
That definitely makes sense. I think really the first step is just being able to identify what you just said, is that there really is irrational fear.
Yeah.
And then there's fear that you have for a really good reason. I think they're really difficult to separate, unless you've kind of practiced it a lot. Like, for me, I mean, for years in the mountains or on, maybe difficult multi-pitch routes or whatever, I felt kind of overwhelmed by fear. And it was both maybe a little bit of rational fear because maybe there was going to be a run out or something, but mostly just like, I was kind of afraid of heights. Like, wow, I'm way the heck up here. I don't want to fall. I felt like I was free soloing, even though I was totally safe. And it took a long time for me to really understand that, okay, I can take all that fear and just try to put it aside, and let's focus on what's actually going on here. I mean, do I have any reason to really be afraid for my safety? Usually the answer was no. So, but yeah, it takes it. For some people, I think it comes easy. Like, some people just aren't that afraid of heights, or they aren't afraid of being exposed on a mountain or whatever. But for me, I was a lot of fear. I still do. And so
Yeah.
it's something I've kind of worked on a lot, and it's something I try to keep working on, because I feel that fear a lot, and it's annoying. And it definitely holds me back sometimes. So yeah, to try to master that is a big goal of mine, kind of every year.
That's so interesting, because I think so many people would run into that fear initially with this sport and say it's not for me.
Yeah. I know. I mean, like, God, I probably should have just done that because that would have been easier. but I think actually, um, I think overcoming personal fear is actually a big draw for me in climbing. I think um, I wish I didn't have that irrational fear that I sometimes have, but when I do overcome it, it feels like a triumph. Um, and mastering yourself, I guess, is a pretty interesting goal. And I'm far from that, but it's something I just continue to work on. And for some reason, I like that challenge.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And you talk about like mantras in your article. Could you share if there are any strategies that have helped you?
Well, in terms of sort of a mantra, or it can be that or a strategy, really, is I do try to tell myself one move at a time.
Yeah.
That has actually helped me quite a lot, believe it or not. It's so simple, um, but usually when I feel fear, or if I feel overwhelmed for any reason, um, and this goes for all of life, if I just think about the next thing that has to happen, just one thing, then it's all just suddenly so much easier to deal with. And in climbing, whether it's a red point or an onsite or some big multi-pitch route or whatever it is, like I tell myself sometimes audibly, one move at a time, and that'll help me just focus on the one move and not worry about, ooh, I might be too pumped up here, or I might be afraid right there, or I might not be able to clip, or whatever it is. So that's my kind of mantra and strategy, I'd say.
Yeah, I really like that advice because I've even felt just learning to lead climb at the gym. It's terrifying. It's such a big jump from
Yeah,
going from top rope or bouldering even.
totally. Yeah, yeah.
And one thing I did want to talk to you too is I see you're into free diving, or some of your stories you did a free diving trip.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really kind of fun thing to be a newbie at a sport. So yeah.
Yeah, what drew you to that? I've tried that once and loved it.
For me, like, it's funny. So as a kid, my parents would maybe once a year um, take a trip somewhere like Hawaii or Mexico. Excuse me. And we'd go swimming and snorkeling. And I always loved snorkeling. And the thing I loved most about it was diving down and holding my breath and trying to find some fish. And um, yeah, there was one time where somebody in this group had dropped their mask, and we were in about 45 feet of water, and the guy in the boat was just like, oh, I'll get my scuba gear later, and we'll get the mask. And then everyone went onto the boat to have lunch, and I stayed in the water, and I was like, I could see, it was super clear, I could see the mask at the bottom from the surface, and I was like, I wonder if I can get that. And um, I tried and tried and tried, and then um, finally I made it, got the mask, and came back up and gave it to the guy in the boat, and he was like, "Where did you get this? Like, who got this for you?" And I was like, "Well, I actually just kind of got it." And he didn't believe me at first. Um,
Yeah.
all that to say, I'm not particularly talented or anything at it, but I was really curious about that challenge for some reason, and then I kind of forgot about all that. I didn't even know freediving was something you could take a class for. Like, I just didn't know any of that. And then in 2021, I was at a wedding in actually John Glassberg's wedding in Virgin Gorda, and I went snorkeling with Tim Emmett, that famous Brit climber, and he was into freediving at the time, and he and I went snorkeling together, diving down kind of deep, and he was like, "Hey, you seem to like this. You should take a course." I was like, "Really? There's courses for this?" So anyway, that's how I got into it, and I just really loved it. Took a couple classes, and I thought it was great. And I don't get to dive often just because I'm in Colorado, but
Yeah.
when I can, I really enjoy it.
What, if any, do you think there are threads that connect any of the hobbies you enjoy? Are there parallels that freediving has that climbing might share?
Yeah, definitely the personal kind of challenge, I guess. Um, and I like that it's kind of, what am I trying to say? Like, team sports are awesome. I love soccer, but often whether we lost or won, I was either partly responsible or maybe not responsible at all for anything, and that just didn't seem as satisfying to me as things like running or freediving or climbing, where it's kind of all up to me, and it's all on me. If I do well, then I did something right. If I mess up or whatever, then it's my fault. For some reason, I just really like being the one who's responsible for what happens, and so yeah, with freediving, there's a very measurable way to progress. Depth is not subjective like climbing grades, and so I'm kind of OCD like that, and I'm attracted to that. Like, oh, okay, these are the hard numbers, and what's it like to go a little bit deeper? And I know when I go a little bit deeper. So yeah, it's pretty cool. But even more importantly than that is just the mental state that is required for me to dive well, and to feel relaxed is a really, it's been difficult for me to find that mental state, but when I do reach that state, it's blissful, and I feel like it can really be applicable to climbing.
Yeah, well said. I can completely empathize with that.
Yeah, so like, tell me about your freediving for a minute if you can. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, no, I had a similar experience. Like, there was a class, and I've done scuba before, and so just signed up for freediving and found it's very focusing in the same way climbing is.
Yeah, yep, very much.
So I'd love to do a few speed round questions for you before we wrap up. Does that work with you?
That's great.
Okay. So first question, what's your least favorite climbing hold?
Underclings.
You have a favorite?
I like textured pinches.
Okay, ATC or Gree?
Gree.
Freedive or skydive?
Freedive.
Tea or coffee?
Coffee for sure.
Okay, got it. Yeah, are you a big coffee drinker?
Yeah, I do like coffee.
Yeah. Cats or dogs?
I'm gonna say dogs. No, I'm gonna say cats. Cats.
Does this question make sense to you? What is your Roman Empire?
I had never heard of that before, so not really. But you said that means like something kind of random that I think about often.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if this counts, but because it's not exactly random, but I do think about my breathing often.
Yes.
I think the random part about that is just it'll just pop into my mind at seemingly random times, and I'll just try to pay attention. Like, wait, why am I breathing like that? Or how can I breathe to be more relaxed right now, or something.
Okay. Last one is music in the outdoors. Yes or no?
I'd say no in general, but it does depend on the setting.
Yeah.
I've been at certain sport crags with a small group of friends, and somebody's brought music, and I've really enjoyed it. In general, I'd say no.
And the last question is, where can people find you?
Yeah, so I mean, I have an Instagram account at Christopher Weidner, and Facebook. I post my articles to both of those. Yeah.
Dailycamera.com too.
Yeah. Daily Camera website. The problem with that is that I think my articles are usually kind of blocked by you have to have a subscription, and most people don't have a subscription to the Daily Camera. So I do post the text of my articles though on Instagram and Facebook. So
okay,
you can read stuff there.
Worth noting, the Daily Camera is only $1 for a year, so it's not a huge.
Is that
paywall.
right? Is it only $1 for a year?
Yeah.
Interesting.
For the first year, and then it looks.
Yeah,
like
I was going to say that must be an intro thing, but yeah, hey, $1. I'd pay $1.
Yeah, it's worth it. Cool. Thanks so much.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Check out Chris's Instagram at Chris Weidner and his writings on boulderdaily.com.